Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are finally covering the big one. I'm surprised we haven't gone here sooner, but honestly, it is a beast. It is the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It's the story of a sun-soaked paradise in Portugal that turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. A window left open, a child vanished into thin air, and a mystery that has divided the world for nearly 20 years. Was it a stranger in the night? A burglary gone wrong? Or was the answer sitting at the dinner table all along? This case has everything. Bungled police work, media frenzies, spies, and endless twists. It is complicated, it is tragic, and we are going to break it all down. But before we dive into the shadows, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out and ensures you never miss a deep dive like this. Now, let's just dive in, shall we? The Atlantic Ocean did not look like a threat from the balcony. It looked like a promise. It was late afternoon on April the 28th, 2007, and the sun was beginning its slow, lazy descent over the Algarve, casting long shadows that stretched across the white walls of the Ocean Club resort. For the families arriving from the grey, rain-swept United Kingdom, this warmth felt like a benediction. They had come to Praia da Luz, the beach of light, seeking a pause in their demanding lives. They were doctors, most of them, professionals who spent their days fighting death and disease in sterile hospitals. Here, they believed, they were untouchable. Jerry and Kate McCann, alongside their friends who would soon become infamous as the Top of Seven, moved with the easy confidence of the upper middle class. They were people accustomed to control. They controlled operating theaters. They controlled complex medical diagnoses, and they controlled their own destinies. It never occurred to them, as they unpacked suitcases filled with summer clothes and children's toys, that they had just stepped into a place where they had no control at all. Praia da Luz was a deception. On the surface, it was a family paradise, a former fishing village scrubbed clean and repurposed for the leisure of Northern Europeans. English was spoken more frequently than Portuguese on the main boulevards. The menus offered chips and burgers alongside the grilled sardines. It felt familiar, safe, a home away from home with better weather. But beneath the veneer of tourism, the Algarve was a porous borderland. It was a gateway for illegal transport from North Africa into Europe. It was a region where the disparity between the wealthy visitors and the local poverty created a friction that the tourists, behind their sunglasses, rarely noticed. The McCanns were assigned apartment 5A. It was a ground-floor unit situated at the very edge of the complex. To the casual observer, it was convenient, close to the pool and the restaurant. To a criminal, it was a gift. The apartment sat flush against a public road, the Rua Doutor Agostinho da Silva. There were no high fences, no security guards patrolling a perimeter, no cameras watching the doors. Anyone could walk down that street, hop the low wall, and stand on the patio. The distinction between the private sanctuary of the family and the public world of the street was terrifyingly thin, separated only by a sliding glass door that was frequently left unlocked. For the first few days, the holiday fell into a seductive rhythm. The group was large, 9 adults, and a number of their young ones. They were a tribe, moving between the swimming pools, the tennis courts, and the beach. They were loud, happy, and conspicuous. They felt safety in their numbers. If one parent was busy, another was watching. It was a collective, communal existence that reinforced the illusion that nothing could go wrong. Kate McCann, a striking woman with a reserved demeanor, felt the exhaustion of motherhood and work beginning to lift. Her daughter, Madeleine, was days away from her birthday. Madeleine was described as energetic and expressive, with a distinctive mark in her eye, a coloboma that made her gaze intense and unforgettable. The siblings, Sean and Amelie, were still very young, in the heavy, sleep-dependent stage of early years. For Kate and Jerry, this week was supposed to be about reconnection, about being husband and wife as much as mother and father. The Ocean Club offered a night creche, a service where staff would watch the children in a secure location while the parents dined. It was a standard feature of such resorts, designed to give adults their evenings back. Most families used it without a second thought, But the McCanns and their friends rejected the idea. They discussed it, certainly. They weighed the pros and cons. Kate felt that the children were too young to be left with strangers late at night. She worried that if they woke up in a strange room, surrounded by people they did not know, they would be distressed. She wanted them in their own beds, with their own smells, their own toys, their established routines. They devised a system. It was a system born of arrogance and naivety, the kind of plan that makes perfect sense to rational, intelligent people who have never experienced true malice. They would dine at the Tapas restaurant, a small open-air eatery located within the resort complex, just a short walk from their apartments. It was close, so close that Jerry jokingly measured the distance in footsteps. They decided they would leave the children asleep in the apartments and take turns acting as a patrol. Every 20 minutes or so, one of the adults would leave the dinner table, walk back to the blocks, check that the children were sleeping, and return. They called it baby listening, a throwback to a simpler time, perhaps the 1950s, when neighbors left front doors open and community was a tangible safety net. They convinced themselves it was no different from having a dinner party in their own garden at home in Leicestershire, popping upstairs to check on the kids. But they were not in Leicestershire. They were in a foreign country, on a public street, in a resort that was open to anyone who cared to walk through it. The staff at the Ocean Club watched this group with a mixture of professional courtesy and private bewilderment. They saw the comings and goings, the long dinners that stretched into the night, the bottles of wine consumed as the laughter grew louder. They saw the reservation book at the restaurant podium, where a note had been scrawled requesting the same large table every night, the table with the best line of sight to the apartments. That note, innocent in its intent, was a broadcast. It told anyone who could read upside down that this group of parents would be at this specific location, at this specific time, every single night of the week. It was a schedule. It was a pattern. And predators thrive on patterns. Unknown to the McCanns, they were not the only ones watching the apartment block. In the months leading up to their arrival, the British consulate in the Algarve had been quietly dealing with reports of a dangerous individual operating in the area. A man, described as foul-smelling and not local, had been breaking into holiday villas. He did not steal valuables. He entered bedrooms where people slept. He watched them. Sometimes he disturbed them. The authorities knew this. The resort management likely knew there had been incidents. But the tourists were kept in the dark. A travel warning might hurt business. Panic was bad for the economy. So the McCanns unpacked their bags in apartment 5A, completely unaware that they had walked into a dangerous territory. On the morning of May the 3rd, the facade of normalcy began to crack, though no one recognized the sound of the splintering. It was a Thursday. The family had been there for 5 days. The routine was cemented. Breakfast, creche, tennis, pool, high tea for the kids, bedtime, adult dinner. It was clockwork. At the breakfast table, Madeleine, spooning cereal into her mouth, looked up at her mother with the sharp, inquisitive expression that defined her. She asked a question that would haunt Kate McCann for the rest of her life. "Mummy," she said, her voice small but clear, "why didn't you come when Sean and I were crying last night?" The question hung in the air, suspended in the morning light. Kate paused. She looked at Jerry. They had checked. They had done their patrol. They had not heard crying. Had the children woken up in the interval between checks? Had they cried themselves back to sleep before the next parent arrived? Or, a darker thought that Kate pushed away immediately, had someone been in the room? Had someone woken them? Kate dismissed the fear. She was a woman of science, a GP. She dealt in facts. The fact was that children dreamt. Children woke up and went back to sleep. She explained it away gently, reassuring Madeleine that they were always close by. But the seed was planted. A tiny, cold kernel of doubt in the pit of her stomach. Later, she would wonder if that was the moment she should have packed their bags. That was the moment she should have locked the doors and never let them out of her sight. But the sun was shining, the tennis courts were waiting, and the inertia of the holiday was too strong to break over a young one's comment. The day proceeded with terrifying normality. There is a specific kind of horror in looking back at the last happy photographs of a family. The smiles seem too wide, the sunlight too bright. There is a picture taken that afternoon by the pool. Madeleine appears in the photo, wearing a hat, sitting next to her father. Jerry is smiling, relaxed. It is the face of a man who thinks he has everything. He does not know that the sand is running out of the hourglass. He does not know that every second ticking by is bringing him closer to the end of his life as he knows it. As evening approached, the weather turned slightly cooler. The group began their nightly ritual. The children were bathed. The smell of sunscreen and milk filled the apartment. The siblings were placed in their beds, the mesh sides creating a soft cage for their dreams. Madeleine, wearing her pink and white Eeyore pajamas, climbed into the single bed. She had a personal belonging with her. Kate read them a story. It was a moment of profound peace. The room was dim, the sounds of the resort muffled by the walls. She kissed them good night. She adjusted the blackout blind. She drew the curtains. Now came the fatal decision, the small act that would be debated by millions of people for decades to come. The patio doors. The sliding glass doors led directly out to the small terrace and the pool area beyond. It was the route the parents used to check on the children, the quickest path to the tapas restaurant. Locking them required a key, and coming in from the outside required fiddling with that key in the dark. Leaving them unlocked, simply pulled shut, was easier. It was convenient. And surely, it was safe. The curtains were drawn. No one knew they were unlocked. Kate pulled the door to. It clicked into the frame, but the latch did not engage. It was closed, but it was open. Jerry and Kate shared a glass of white wine on the balcony before heading down. It was around 8:30 in the evening. They checked the children one last time. All three were fast asleep. Their breathing was steady. Was the only movement in the still room. The parents walked out, leaving the apartment silent. They walked the 50 yards to the restaurant. They sat down with their friends. They ordered food. They poured wine. They laughed. The clock ticked to 9 o'clock. Jerry stood up. "My turn," he said. He walked the familiar path back to the apartment. He let himself in. He peered into the bedroom. The door was open wide enough to see the beds. The children were sleeping. He felt a surge of affection, that specific, overwhelming love a parent feels when watching their children at rest. He paused, listening to their breathing. He needed the toilet, so he used the bathroom in the apartment before leaving. On his way out, he noticed the door to the children's bedroom was open a little wider than he remembered leaving it. A draft? He shrugged it off. He pulled the door back to its original angle, ajar but not gaping. He walked back to the restaurant. On the way, he stopped to chat with a fellow tourist, a man named Jez Wilkins, who was walking his own child in a stroller. They stood on the street, talking about tennis, about the weather, about fatherhood. While they stood there, just feet away from the apartment, a woman named Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, walked past them. She was on her way to check her own children. She saw Jerry and Jez talking. And then she saw something else. Or she thought she did. At the top of the road, crossing the intersection, she saw a man. He was walking quickly, purposely. He was carrying someone. The person being carried was wearing pajamas, pink and white pajamas. The figure's legs were dangling, bare feet pointing downward. The man did not look like a tourist. He did not look like a father taking a sleeping child for a stroll. He looked like someone fleeing. Jane Tanner did not stop him. Why would she? In a resort full of families, a man carrying someone who appeared small and lightly dressed. She did not know that the child in the apartment 5 minutes ago was wearing those exact clothes. She walked on. She checked her children. She returned to the table. She did not mention the man. Not yet. The dinner continued. The wine flowed. The appetizers were cleared. The conversation turned to tennis scores and hospital politics. At 9:30, Matthew Oldfield volunteered to go. He was checking his own children in the adjacent block and offered to check the McCann's apartment too. Kate, grateful, stayed seated. Oldfield walked to apartment 5A. He found the patio door unlocked, just as it had been. He walked in. The apartment was silent. He stood in the doorway of the children's room. He saw the twins in their cots. He could not see Madeleine's bed from where he stood, not clearly. But the room was quiet. He assumed that silence meant safety. He turned around. He walked out. He went back to the restaurant. All quiet, he said. It was the lie they all wanted to believe. But something was wrong. Even as they sat there, finishing their main courses, the atmosphere in the apartment had changed. The silence was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of absence. At 10 o'clock, Kate stood up. "I will go now," she said. She wrapped a cardigan around her shoulders against the evening chill. She walked the short distance. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, but she suppressed it. She walked to the patio doors. She slid them open. The curtains in the children's bedroom, which she had drawn so carefully, were billowing. Wind. Wind meant the window was open. She froze. She knew she had closed the window. She knew she had lowered the heavy metal shutters. She stepped into the room. The door slammed shut behind her, caught by the sudden draft from the open window. The noise was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. She pushed the door open again. She looked at the bed. The cuddle cat was there. The pink blanket was there. Madeleine was not. Kate's mind rejected the image. It was a mistake. Madeleine was in the bathroom. Madeleine had climbed into her parents' bed. Madeleine was hiding. "Madeleine?" she whispered. She checked the parents' bedroom. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the cupboards. Empty. She ran back to the children's room. The window was wide open. The shutters were raised all the way up. The street outside was dark and empty. The panic hit her not as a thought, but as a physical blow. It knocked the breath from her lungs. The reality of the world rushed in, destroying the bubble of the holiday, destroying the illusion of safety, destroying the life she had built. She ran. She ran back through the apartment, out of the patio doors, leaving them gaping open like a wound. She ran toward the restaurant, toward the light, toward the laughter of her friends who were still sitting there, oblivious, finishing their wine. As she ran, a sound tore from her throat. It was a sound that no human being should ever have to make. It was the sound of a mother realizing that the worst thing imaginable has already happened. "Madeleine's gone," she screamed, her voice cracking, shattering the peace of the Praia de Luz night. "Someone's taken her." At the table, the laughter stopped. Heads turned, glasses were lowered, and in the distance, the sound of the ocean continued its relentless, indifferent rhythm, washing away the footprints in the sand, washing away the time, washing away the truth. The gilded cage had been broken open, and the bird had flown into the dark. The scream did not just break the silence. It shattered the structural integrity of the evening. At the tapas restaurant, the sound traveled 50 yards in a heartbeat, hitting the table of doctors like a physical wave. Jerry McCann dropped his glass. The wine spilled, a blood-red stain spreading across the white tablecloth. But he was already moving. The primal urgency in his wife's voice bypassed the logical centers of his brain and tapped directly into the adrenaline-fueled instinct of a father. He reached the apartment in seconds, his friends trailing behind him in a disorganized pack. He found Kate standing in the middle of the children's bedroom, her body trembling so violently she looked as if she were having a seizure. She pointed at the bed, the empty bed. The pink duvet was pulled back. The cuddle cat lay there, a soft, mute witness to a crime that made no sense. Jerry dropped to his knees. He looked under the bed. It was a futile, desperate act. The clearance was barely inches, impossible for a child to squeeze under, but logic had fled the room. He tore open the wardrobe doors. He checked the bathroom again. He ran into his own bedroom. He checked the kitchen cupboards. He was tearing the apartment apart, creating a whirlwind of disturbance in what was now a crime scene. "She is gone, Jerry," Kate cried, her voice ragged. "The window. Look at the window." Jerry looked. The window was open. The shutters were raised. He ran outside, onto the street, frantic. He looked left, toward the town center. He looked right, toward the dark expanse of the beach. There was nothing but streetlights and shadows. "Madeleine," he roared. The name echoed off the white walls of the resort, a sound of pure anguish. Back in the apartment, the timeline of destruction began. The friends, the Tapas 7, crowded into the small rooms. They touched surfaces. They opened doors. They comforted Kate, holding her, their hands transferring fibers and DNA onto her clothes, onto the bedding, onto the walls. In the lexicon of criminal investigation, this period is known as the golden hour, the immediate window following a crime where evidence is fresh, witnesses are present, and the trail is hot. In apartment 5A, the golden hour was not being used, it was being murdered. Matthew Oldfield ran to the resort reception. He slammed his hands on the desk, startling the night staff. "Call the police," he shouted. "Someone has gone missing." The receptionist, pale and wide-eyed, fumbled for the phone. The protocol for a missing person usually assumed a wanderer, a little one who had sleepwalked out the door. They mobilized the staff to search the pool, the tennis courts, the perimeter. They did not lock down the gates. They did not seal the exits. 60 people joined the search within 20 minutes. Staff, guests, friends, strangers. They trampled through the flower beds outside the apartment window, destroying any footprints that might have been left in the soft earth. They walked through the apartment, bringing in sand and dirt from the outside. They shouted Madeleine's name, creating a cacophony that would have masked the sound of a crying child or a fleeing vehicle. Jerry ran back to the apartment. He found the shutters raised. In a moment of confusion, or perhaps trying to test how the abductor had entered, he lowered them. Then he raised them again. He touched the mechanism. He touched the sill. With every movement, he was overwriting the story the forensic evidence might have told. Kate was pacing the living room, kicking the walls, a physical manifestation of her helplessness. "We let her down," she screamed, a mantra of guilt that would be used against her by the press for years. "We went to dinner and we let her down." A woman from the resort staff, Sylvia, arrived to help. She saw the father on the floor, sobbing, hammering his fists into the tiles. She saw the mother hysterical. And amidst this storm of noise and grief, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. In the twin cots, Sean and Amelie were sleeping. They did not stir. They did not cry. Despite the screaming, the slamming doors, the 60 people shouting outside, the lights being turned on and off, the twins remained in a deep, motionless slumber. Sylvia found it unnatural. She mentioned it to a colleague. The observation was whispered, passed from person to person, a small seed of suspicion planted in the very first hour of the mystery. Outside, the golden hour ticked away. The roads out of Praia de Luz remained open. The border to Spain, just 90 minutes away, remained unmonitored. The ferries to North Africa continued to load passengers. The ocean remained vast and unsearchable. And the abductor, whoever they were, was given the greatest gift a criminal can receive: time. The first police officers to arrive were not detectives. They were the GNR, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, essentially a paramilitary force that patrolled the rural areas and small towns. They arrived just after 11 o'clock at night, nearly an hour after Kate had raised the alarm. They were equipped for traffic accidents and bar fights, not a sophisticated abduction. The officers walked into apartment 5A. They saw the crowd. They saw the open doors. They did not tape off the scene immediately. They did not separate the witnesses. They did not confiscate mobile phones. They treated it, initially, as a case of a child wandering off. They assumed Madeleine would be found asleep under a bush in the garden. It was past midnight when the realization set in that this was something darker. The GNR contacted the PJ, the Policia Judiciaria, the agency responsible for investigating serious crimes. The PJ headquarters were in Portimao, a drive away. The detectives would not arrive until much later. By the time the sun began to rise on May the 4th, the dynamic had shifted. The resort was no longer a holiday destination. It was a cage. The McCanns had been moved to a different apartment, but the damage to the crime scene was irreversible. Detective Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral, the man who would become the face of the Portuguese investigation, arrived to chaos. He saw the trampled flower beds. He saw the smudged fingerprints on the window. He felt a simmering anger at the incompetence of the initial response, but he also felt a prickle of instinct. He looked at the parents. They were devastated, yes, but there were inconsistencies. The timeline felt too rigid, too rehearsed. The checking system seemed reckless to his Portuguese sensibilities. In Portugal, family was everything. Leaving children alone to dine out was culturally alien. It looked like negligence. And in the mind of a detective, negligence is only a step away from culpability. Then came the reports about the twins. The medical staff who examined them later noted they were unusually quiet and drowsy. The whisper campaign grew louder. Had they been sedated? Had the parents drugged them to ensure a quiet dinner? If they had, and Madeleine had woken up. Or worse, if she had been given too much. The theory of an accident began to form in the minds of the investigators before they had even fully ruled out an abduction. But there were other leads, threads that dangled tantalizingly in the wind. A family of Irish tourists, the Smiths, came forward with a statement. On the night of the disappearance, around 10 o'clock, the exact time Kate was discovering the empty bed, they had been walking back from the pub. They were near the crossroads, a short distance from the Ocean Club. They saw a man. He was carrying someone. Martin Smith described the man as white, aged between 35 and 40, wearing beige trousers. The individual carried was small, blonde, barefoot, wearing light-colored pajamas. She appeared to be in a deep sleep, her head resting against the man's chest, her arms hanging down. At the time, the Smiths did not know a child was missing. They thought it was just someone carrying another person home. But the timing was precise. The location was correct. The description of the child matched Madeleine perfectly. The police took the statement, but it sat in a file, competing with hundreds of other sightings. A woman in Morocco claimed to see her. A tourist in Spain claimed to see her. The noise of false leads was deafening. The British media descended within 24 hours. Satellite trucks clogged the narrow streets of Praia da Luz. Reporters thrust microphones into the faces of the grieving parents. The pressure on the Portuguese police became immense. This was not just a local case anymore. It was an international incident. The British government was watching. The world was watching. The PJ needed a win. They needed a suspect. And since they could not find the man the Smiths saw, and they could not find a trace of Madeleine, they looked for the person who was closest to the fire. His name was Robert Murat. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was not a drifter. He was a property consultant, a British man who lived with his elderly mother in a villa just 150 yards from the McCann's apartment. He was 33 years old, divorced, with a young daughter of his own who lived in England. Murat made a fatal mistake. He tried to help. When the story broke, Murat felt a sense of civic duty. He spoke fluent Portuguese and English. He saw the confusion between the British witnesses and the local police. He stepped forward. He offered his services as a translator. He stood at the police cordon, translating statements, explaining procedures to the journalists, offering coffee to the exhausted searchers. To a rational observer, this was kindness. To a cynical press pack and a desperate police force, it was suspicious behavior. Why was he so involved? Why was he always there? Was he inserting himself into the investigation to monitor its progress? Was he enjoying the thrill of the chase? The journalists began to dig. They found his appearance unsettled them. He had a glass eye, the result of a motorcycle accident. It gave him a distinct, asymmetrical gaze. The tabloids, cruel and hungry for a villain, fixated on it. They called him odd. They called him creepy. They stripped away his humanity and turned him into a caricature. A journalist from a British Sunday newspaper became convinced Murat was the man. She whispered in the ears of the police. She pointed out that he fit the general description of a man seen lurking, though the descriptions were vague. She noted that he lived just down the road, in the exact direction the Smith family had seen the man walking. 12 days after Madeleine disappeared, the police made their move. It was dawn. The quiet street where Murat lived with his mother, the Casa Liliana, was suddenly filled with unmarked cars. Officers swarmed the property. They banged on the door. They did not ask for translation this time. They dragged Robert Murat out of his home. They tore the villa apart. They drained the swimming pool. They dug up the flower beds. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for a body beneath the driveway. They confiscated his computers, his phone, his daughter's toys. Murat was taken to the police station in Portimao. He was held for hours. They interrogated him aggressively. They asked him where he was that night. He told them he was at home with his mother. They asked him why he had helped. He told them he was just trying to be a good neighbor. They did not believe him. They declared him an arguido, a formal suspect. In the Portuguese legal system, this status is a limbo. It means the police have enough suspicion to interrogate you with legal caution, but not enough evidence to charge you. It allows them to restrict your movement and creates a permanent stain on your name. When Murat emerged from the station, the cameras were waiting. The flashbulbs blinded him. The crowd shouted abuse. His face was plastered on the front page of every newspaper in Europe. The villain, the headline screamed, "Officers raid villa of one-eyed man." But there was a problem. Un significant problème. There was no evidence. The police found no DNA in his house. The radar showed no body under the driveway. His computers showed no illicit material. The witnesses who claimed to have seen him near the apartment that night began to contradict themselves. One of the Tapas 7 claimed to see him, but others said he was nowhere near. Furthermore, the police sketch that had circulated, which supposedly resembled the abductor, was a disaster. It was a featureless oval with hair, an egg with a side parting, as it was mocked in the press. It looked like everyone and no one. Trying to pin that sketch on Murat was an act of desperation. Robert Murat was innocent. He was simply a man who had walked into the middle of a tornado. But the investigation had lost weeks focusing on him. While they were draining his pool and analyzing his hard drive, the real abductor, if there was one, was putting distance between himself and Praia da Luz. The Murat fiasco damaged the credibility of the Portuguese police. It made them look incompetent, vindictive, and prone to tunneling vision. The British public began to turn on them. The relationship between the McCanns and the investigators, already frayed, began to snap. And amidst the circus of the false suspect, the real question remained unanswered. If Robert Murat didn't take her, and if she didn't wander off, where was Madeleine? The failure to pin the crime on Murat forced the police to pivot. The lens of the investigation swung around, moving away from the villa down the street and focusing back, with cold, hard precision, on apartment 5A, on the parents. Praia da Luz ceased to be a village and became a stage set. In the weeks following the disappearance, the satellite trucks multiplied until they formed a steel barricade along the seafront. Cables snaked across the cobblestones like black vipers. The air hummed with the static of live broadcasts and the chatter of 1,000 journalists in a dozen languages. The campaign to find Madeleine McCann had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of missing person cases. It was no longer an investigation. It was a global brand. The image of the little girl, the blonde hair, the wide eyes, the distinctive bleed in the iris of her right eye was plastered on everything. It was on posters in shop windows from Berlin to Baghdad. It was on the t-shirts of footballers running onto pitches in the Premier League. It was on the side of buses in America. Jerry and Kate McCann, propelled by a desperate need to keep the story alive, hired public relations experts. They understood a fundamental, brutal truth of the modern news cycle. Silence is death. If people stopped looking, their daughter would never be found. So they fed the beast. They launched the Find Madeleine Fund. They released balloons. They wore yellow and green wristbands, symbols of hope that were soon seen on the wrists of celebrities and politicians. But this media offensive had a double edge. To the Portuguese police, and specifically to Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral, it felt like a coordinated attack. Every press conference where the McCanns pleaded for help was interpreted as a silent condemnation of the Portuguese authorities. The British government weighed in, with Prime Minister Gordon Brown making direct calls to his counterparts in Lisbon. It was diplomatic arm-twisting, a colonial power barking orders at a smaller nation, and it bred deep resentment in the corridors of the Polícia Judiciária. The spectacle reached its zenith and its nadir when the parents left the twins in Portugal to fly to Rome. They stood in street, Peter's Square, holding a photograph of Madeleine, waiting for a blessing from Pope Benedict XVI. The cameras clicked furiously as the pontiff touched the image. It was a moment of profound religious significance for the devout Catholic couple, but back in the Algarve, the mood was turning. Why? The locals muttered. Were the parents jet-setting around Europe while their daughter was missing in Portugal? Why were they meeting celebrities instead of walking the scrubland? The narrative of the grieving parents began to fracture. In its place, a darker image emerged. The cold doctors, too composed, too managed, too focused on the campaign rather than the crime. The circus had come to town, but the clowns were not funny, and the acrobats were falling. And in the shadows of the spotlight, the police stopped looking for a stranger in the night and started looking at the people standing center stage. While the cameras focused on the parents, a quiet war was being waged against their friends. The Tapas 7, the group of medical professionals who had dined with the McCanns that night, were no longer seen as victims of a tragedy, but as the key to a mystery. Investigative journalists, hungry for a scoop that went beyond the press releases, began to dig into the timelines provided by the group. They laid out the statements like a deck of cards, looking for the card that didn't match. There were discrepancies. Small ones, at first. A difference of 5 minutes here, a contradiction about who checked which child there. But then, the gaps widened. The staff at the Ocean Club whispered that the group was not as attentive as they claimed. They remembered long periods where no one left the table. They remembered the laughter being loud, the wine flowing freely. A Portuguese newspaper published a bombshell article titled, "The Pact of Silence." It alleged that the friends had agreed to coordinate their stories to protect themselves, not necessarily from a murder charge, but from a charge of severe negligence. They were doctors, respectable people with careers and reputations. If it was proven that they had abandoned their children every night to get drunk, they could face social services investigations in the United Kingdom. They could lose their medical licenses. The article posited a theory that spread like a virus through the investigation. Self-preservation. And then there was the matter of the sedation. It was a rumor that refused to die. It started with the twins. Sean and Amelie had slept through the screaming of their mother, the chaos of the search, and the lights being blazed on and off. To the police, this was physiologically impossible for a natural sleep. Detectives began to ask pointed questions. Were they given anything to help them sleep? Did the doctors, tired of their energetic at an early developmental stage, use their medical access to use medication? Calpol or something else? The theory was seductive in its simplicity. If the children were sedated, and Madeleine had woken up groggy and fallen, or if the dosage had been miscalculated, then there was no abductor. There was no man in the shadows. There was only an accident, a panic, and a cover-up. The Tapas 7 closed ranks. They refused to speak to the press. They hired lawyers. Their silence, intended to protect their privacy, was interpreted by the Portuguese public as an admission of guilt. The wall of silence had been built, but the police were about to bring in a battering ram. The battering ram arrived on 4 legs. In late July, the investigation had stalled. The forensic teams had scrubbed the apartment and found nothing conclusive. Desperate, the Portuguese authorities requested help from the British police. They asked for the best tools available, Eddie and Keela. Eddie was a victim recovery dog, a Springer Spaniel trained to detect the scent of human remains, the specific signs left behind. Keela was a crime scene dog, trained to detect human blood, even if it had been scrubbed clean or was years old. Their track record was impeccable. They had found victims concealed in difficult places. They had found traces on washed clothes. They did not know politics. They did not watch the news. They only knew the scent. The handler, Martin Grime, brought the dogs to apartment 5A. The apartment had been empty for weeks, cleaned by professional cleaners, and rented out to unsuspecting tourists before being sealed again. First, Eddie went in. The small dog scampered through the living room, tail wagging, nose working the air. He ignored the kitchen. He ignored the parents' bedroom. He moved toward the living room, near the window, behind the sofa. Suddenly, his demeanor changed. He stopped. He barked. A sharp, insistent bark. The handler marked the spot. Eddie moved to the bedroom. He sniffed the wardrobe. He barked again. He sniffed the veranda outside. He barked again. Then Keela was brought in. She was trained to freeze, not bark, when she found blood. She moved through the same spaces. Behind the sofa, where Eddie had barked, Keela froze. She pointed her nose at the tiles. The police watched in stunned silence. The dogs were alerting to death and blood in the apartment from which a child had supposedly been abducted alive. But the dogs were not finished. They were taken to a villa the McCanns had rented weeks after the disappearance. Inside, Kate McCann's clothes were laid out. Eddie alerted to a pair of trousers. He alerted to the soft toy, Cuddle Cat, the toy Kate had clutched in every press appearance. The scent of a cadaver was on the toy. The final blow came in the underground car park. The police had seized the silver Renault Scenic the McCanns had hired 25 days after Madeleine went missing. The car had been used to transport trash, groceries, and the twins. Eddie ran around the car. He stopped at the driver's door. He barked. Then he went to the trunk. He barked furiously. Keela investigated the trunk and froze. The implication was horrifying. It suggested that a body had been in the car weeks after the disappearance. It suggested that the body had been moved. For the detectives, the narrative flipped instantly. The abduction theory evaporated. The stranger was a ghost. The evidence, they believed, pointed to the only people who had access to the apartment, the clothes, and the car. The dogs did not lie, the police reasoned. But dogs cannot testify in court. They needed hard evidence. They assaulted the tiles. They cut pieces of the car carpet. They sent the samples to a laboratory in Birmingham, waiting for the DNA that would seal the case. September arrived with a suffocating heat. The relationship between the McCanns and the police had disintegrated into open hostility. The leaks from the laboratory began to trickle out, distorted by translation and malice. A headline screamed, "100% match." It was false. The DNA results were complex, degraded, and inconclusive. The sample from the car trunk contained components of Madeleine's DNA, but also components that could belong to her siblings or parents. It was a complex mixture. In a British court, it would be argued as transfer DNA, hair, or saliva from toys or clothes moved in the car. But in the interrogation room at the Policia Judiciaria headquarters, nuance was a casualty of war. Kate McCann was called in first. She was separated from Jerry. She sat across from the detectives, a translator by her side. The air conditioning hummed, fighting a losing battle against the tension. They did not offer her tea. They offered her a deal. The detective leaned forward, sliding a piece of paper across the table. If she confessed, he said, if she admitted that it was an accident that Madeleine had died in the apartment and they had panicked, she would get a reduced sentence. 2 years, maybe less. She could go home. Jerry would be spared. Kate stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. They were asking her to confess to killing her daughter. "I will not lie," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I did not kill my daughter." The interrogation shifted gears. They bombarded her with 48 questions. Why did the dogs smell death on your clothes? Why did the twins not wake up? Why did you wash Cuddle Cat? Where is the body? Kate refused to answer. On the advice of her lawyer, she exercised her right to silence. For hours, she sat there, answering no comment to every accusation. To the police, her silence was the arrogance of the guilty. To Kate, it was the only shield she had left against a system that had decided her fate. Jerry was brought in next. He was combative, intellectual, refusing to be intimidated. He argued the science of the DNA. He argued the logic of the timeline. "How could we move a body while the world's media was watching us?" he demanded. "Where would we hide it? We have no local knowledge. We have no vehicle." The police did not care about logistics. They had tunnel vision. They believed they were looking at a guilty man who smiled for the cameras. At the end of the grueling sessions, the formal declaration was made. Kate and Jerry McCann were named arguidos, suspects. The news broke instantly. The couple walked out of the police station into a storm of flashbulbs. The crowd, which had once cheered them, now jeered. The grieving mother was now the suspect. The devoted father was the accomplice. They drove back to their villa in silence, the weight of the accusation pressing down on them like a physical force. They were no longer fighting to find Madeleine. They were fighting for their own freedom. And in the darkness of the Portuguese night, the truth seemed further away than ever. The decision to leave Portugal was not made lightly. It was a strategic retreat born of absolute terror. To stay meant remaining in the grip of a judicial system that had already decided their guilt. It meant risking separation, possibly even prison, while their twins were taken into care. To leave meant looking like fugitives running from justice. It was a choice between two nightmares, and Jerry and Kate McCann chose the one that kept their remaining family together. On the 9th of September, 2007, the rental car carrying the new suspects sped toward Faro Airport. The convoy of press vehicles trailing them was like a pack of hunting dogs sensing the kill. Photographers hung out of car windows, risking their lives on the winding Algarve roads to get one last shot of the monsters fleeing the scene of the crime. The scene on the tarmac was chaotic. The passengers on the EasyJet flight found themselves in the middle of a media siege. Journalists had booked seats on the plane at the last minute, turning the cabin into a press conference. The pilot, a man who had signed up to fly tourists, not suspects, had to intervene. He threatened to have the police remove anyone who harassed the couple. For 2 hours, the family sat in the pressurized tube, surrounded by the very people who were writing their destruction. When the wheels touched down in the United Kingdom, the atmosphere had shifted tectonically. They were on home soil, but they were not safe. The British press, once their greatest ally in the search for Madeleine, had turned voracious. The Arguido status was blood in the water. The headlines in the days that followed were savage. Newspapers that had previously printed appeals for information now printed accusations as fact. They claimed the parents had killed her. They claimed they had sold her. They claimed they were living immoral lives, liars and actors. The presumption of innocence had evaporated, replaced by a trial by tabloid. Back in Portugal, the fallout was immediate. Chief Inspector Goncalo Amaral, the man who had spearheaded the theory against the parents, was removed from the case. The British government had applied diplomatic pressure, and the Portuguese hierarchy, embarrassed by the leaks and the lack of hard evidence, cut him loose. Amaral resigned in disgust, but he did not go quietly. He began writing a book, The Truth of the Lie, which would lay out his thesis that Madeleine had died in the apartment. It was the beginning of a legal war that would span decades. The McCanns fought back. They hired top-tier libel lawyers. They launched lawsuits against the newspapers that had defamed them. They won. The newspapers were forced to print front-page apologies and pay massive damages, hundreds of thousands of pounds, which went straight into the fund to find their daughter. The courts acknowledged that there was no evidence to support the horrific claims, but the damage to their public image was permanent. Half the world believed they were victims. The other half believed they were villains who had gotten away with it. In July of 2008, 10 months after their frantic departure, the Portuguese Attorney General made a quiet announcement. The case was being archived. The Arguido status was lifted. Kate and Jerry were no longer formal suspects, but neither were they exonerated. The case was simply shelved, gathering dust in a vault in Portimao, unsolved. There was no body, no confession, and no active investigation. The police had given up. With the official police investigation frozen in a state of suspended animation, the McCanns found themselves in a terrifying position. No one was looking for their daughter. The Portuguese had closed the file. The British police had no jurisdiction. If they wanted answers, they would have to buy them. They turned to the shadowy world of private investigators. It is a landscape populated by retired cops, former spies, and a significant number of charlatans who prey on the desperate. Their first major hire was a Spanish agency based in Barcelona called Metodo 3. The agency was run by a flamboyant director who loved the cameras. He made bold, reckless promises. He told the press he would have Madeleine home by Christmas. He claimed to know exactly who had taken her. He painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal network, a solvable puzzle. The McCanns paid them thousands of pounds a month. In return, the agency set up a hotline. The tips poured in, a deluge of well-meaning hallucinations and cruel hoaxes. Every day, the investigators sifted through the noise. A psychic in Brazil claimed she was buried under a church. A tourist in Malta claimed to have seen her on a boat. A man in Indonesia sent a picture of a blonde child who turned out to be his niece. Then came the Morocco lead. A tourist photographed a person with blonde hair, carried on someone's back of a woman in rural Morocco. The grain of the photo was coarse, but the resemblance was striking. The blonde hair, the pale skin, the leg shape. For a few heart-stopping days, the world held its breath. The parents dared to hope. Was she there? Had she been trafficked across the Strait of Gibraltar, just a short ferry ride from the Algarve? Método 3 scrambled agents to the Atlas Mountains. They tracked down the family. They found the child. Her name was Bushra. She was a local resident. She had albinism in her family, giving her a lighter complexion than her siblings. She was not Madeleine. The photo that had sparked headlines around the globe was just a picture of a Berber girl going to market. The crash after such a high was devastating. It was a pattern that would repeat itself again and again. The surge of adrenaline, the mobilization of resources, the agonizing weight, and the crushing reality. The private investigators were hampered by a lack of police powers. They could not arrest people. They could not subpoena phone records. They could only ask questions and hope people answered. They chased shadows in the underworld, speaking to informants who demanded cash for lies. The fund, built on the donations of pensioners and children's pocket money, was burning at a terrifying rate. The parents were not just fighting grief, they were fighting bankruptcy. They were paying for a machine that seemed designed to consume money and produce nothing but silence. And amidst the failure of Método 3, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a man who promised he had the skills the Spanish detectives lacked. His name was Kevin Halligan, but he presented himself as a character from a spy novel. He was the head of a company called Oakley International, based in Washington, D.C. He was an Irishman who had adopted an American accent and the swagger of a man who walked the corridors of power. Halligan sold the McCanns a dream. He claimed to have connections to the CIA, the FBI, and MI5. He claimed to have access to technology that the local police could only dream of. He spoke of satellite imagery, of thermal rewriting, of covert operatives who could extract information from the darkest corners of the criminal world. He was charismatic, convincing, and utterly fraudulent. The fund hired him. The contract was worth £500,000. Halligan took the money and immediately began to live the lifestyle of a high-rolling secret agent. He stayed in five-star hotels. He hired chauffeur. He drank expensive vintage wines and ate in the finest restaurants, all while the parents believed he was coordinating a massive intelligence operation to find their child. The reality was a farce. Halligan did not have access to spy satellites. When the parents pressed him for the satellite imagery of Praia da Luz on the night of the abduction, evidence they believed might show the kidnapper's vehicle, Halligan stalled. He made excuses about security clearance and red tape. Finally, under immense pressure, he produced the goods. He handed over printouts from Google Earth. They were low-resolution images available to anyone with an internet connection, showing the resort on a sunny day, years before the crime. It was an insult. It was a con. But Halligan's damage went beyond theft. He actively hindered the investigation. During his tenure, his team had actually gathered some valuable intelligence. They had interviewed witnesses and collected data. Most crucially, they had spoken to the Smith family again, the Irish family who had seen the man carrying the child toward the beach. They had worked with the Smiths to create detailed e-fits, computer-generated sketches of the suspect. These sketches were significantly different from the earlier, vague descriptions. They showed a man with ordinary features, someone who did not look like a monster, which made him all the more dangerous. This was the best lead the case had generated in years. Halligan sat on them. Whether through incompetence, malice, or a desire to stretch out the contract and keep the money flowing, he did not release the images to the public. He did not share them effectively with the police. He buried the face of the prime suspect in a drawer while he ordered another bottle of champagne. By the time the fraud was discovered, the damage was done. The money was gone. Halligan was fired and later extradited to the United States to face charges for an unrelated fraud. He died years later in a house in Surrey, alone and disgraced. For the McCanns, the betrayal was a visceral wound. They had entrusted the search for their daughter to a man who saw her not as a missing child, but as a blank check. They had been victimized by the abductor, victimized by the press, victimized by the police, and now victimized by their own saviors. The release of the Smith E. Fitz, years later than intended, would eventually reignite interest in the case. But the time lost to Halligan's vanity was time that Madeleine did not have. The trail had gone from cold to frozen. And yet, in the corridors of power in London, a new determination was forming. The failure of the private investigators proved one thing. This case needed the full, unbridled power of the British state. The turning point came not from a detective's hunch, but from a mother's pen. Kate McCann wrote a book. It was a raw, painful account of her life since May the 3rd, 2007. Published in 2011, it became a bestseller, serialized in the very newspapers that had once vilified her. The money raised went back into the fund, but the book achieved something far more valuable than profit. It shamed the British government into action. For years, the official line from Scotland Yard had been that they had no jurisdiction. The crime happened in Portugal. It was a Portuguese problem. But the book, combined with a personal appeal to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, shifted the political tectonic plates. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, saw the injustice of a British person missing, with no active police force looking for her. She ordered a review. Operation Grange was born. It was a behemoth. Based in London, the team comprised 29 detectives and 8 support staff. They were funded by the Home Office with a budget that would eventually swell to over £12 million. Unlike the private investigators who were chasing shadows for cash, these were seasoned cold case experts. They had the power of the state behind them. They had access to databases, intelligence services, and international cooperation treaties. Their first task was to cleanse the investigation of the toxicity that had plagued it. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, leading the team, made a public declaration that changed everything. The parents were not suspects. Operation Grange was treating the case as an abduction by a stranger. They went back to zero. They took the 40,000 pieces of information gathered over 4 years, the Portuguese files, the private investigator reports, the tips from the public, and they fed them into a supercomputer, the Holmes 2 database. They looked for connections that human eyes had missed. A pattern emerged. The detectives noticed a spike in burglaries in the Praia da Luz area in the months leading up to the disappearance. These were not just opportunistic thefts. They were creeping intrusions. The burglars entered through windows. They sometimes stood over sleeping occupants. In one terrifying instance, an intruder had been disturbed by a child and fled. The theory of burglary gone wrong took center stage. Had a thief broken into apartment 5A, expecting it to be empty? Had he been startled by Madeleine waking up? Had he panicked and taken her to silence her? In 2014, the British police returned to Praia da Luz. It was a massive show of force. They brought ground-penetrating radar. They brought sniffer dogs. They cordoned off a massive area of scrubland near the Ocean Club, land that had been walked over by thousands of tourists. They dug. Under the glare of the world's media, they excavated the earth. They sent men down into the sewers, wading through the underground tunnels of the resort, looking for bones, for clothes, for anything that had survived 7 years of decay. The locals watched with a mixture of curiosity and weary cynicism. They saw the British police tearing up their town again, chasing a ghost. After weeks of searching, the result was devastatingly familiar. Nothing. No body. No weapon. No pajama scraps. The earth yielded only trash and animal bones. The failure of the dig was a blow to the morale of Operation Grange. The public began to turn on the investigation. Taxpayers asked why millions of pounds were being spent on one child when Thousands of other missing persons received barely a glance. The team was scaled down. The 29 detectives became 4. The funding was renewed only in 6-month blocks, a slow drip feed of life support for a dying case. By 2019, Operation Grange was a skeleton crew, tidying up files, waiting for the inevitable order to shut down. They had chased the burglars. They had chased the sex offenders. They had chased the imposters. They had run out of road. But in a police station in Germany, a different file was being opened. And in that file was the name of a man who had been hiding in plain sight. His name was Christian Bruckner. He was not a new name to the Portuguese police, but he was a ghost in the machine, a man whose file had been overlooked in the chaotic early days. In 2020, German prosecutors made an announcement that sent a shockwave through the world. They believed they had found the man who took Madeleine. Bruckner was a drifter, a mechanic, and involved in illicit trade. He was a man who existed on the fringes of society, moving between Germany and Portugal in a battered Volkswagen camper van. He was 30 years old in 2007. He lived a transient life, parking his van on remote beaches, sleeping in laybys, and disappearing whenever the law got too close. His profile was terrifying. He had a history of burglary. He had a history of violence. And, most chillingly, he had a history of severe crimes against the vulnerable. The German police had stumbled upon him almost by accident. In 2013, Bruckner was in a bar in Germany. He was drinking with a friend. The television was on, showing a news report about the 10th anniversary of the Madeleine McCann disappearance. Bruckner, lowering his guard with arrogance, looked at the screen. He sneered. "I know all about that," he allegedly said. "The child is dead, and it was easy." The friend did not go to the police immediately, but years later, that conversation found its way to Scotland Yard. Operation Grange passed the information to the Bundeskriminalamt, the German federal police. They began to dig into Bruckner's life. They found that in 2007, he was living in a farmhouse just a few miles from Praia da Luz. They found that he made his living breaking into holiday apartments. But the smoking gun was digital. The detectives analyzed the mobile phone data from the night of May the 3rd, 2007. They found a record of a phone call. The number belonged to Christian Bruckner. The phone pinged a cell tower in Praia da Luz. The timing was critical. The call was received at 7:32 in the evening and ended at 8:34. It placed him right in the resort, just outside the Ocean Club, in the hour before the McCanns went to dinner. He was there. The man with a history of breaking into resorts. The man with a history of offenses. The man with the camper van capable of transporting a victim across borders unnoticed, was standing in the shadows of the apartment block while the parents put their family to bed. The investigation discovered that the day after the disappearance, Bruckner had re-registered his car, a Jaguar, under a different name. It was the classic behavior of a man trying to distance himself from a vehicle. For the first time in 13 years, the police were not talking about theories. They were not talking about burglary gone wrong or parental involvement. They were talking about an intruder with a specific opportunity. The German prosecutor, Hans Christian Wolters, became the new face of the investigation. He was a serious, unsmiling man who spoke with a certainty that was unnerving. In June 2020, he wrote a letter to Kate and Jerry McCann. The contents were not made public, but the message was clear. He told them that he had concrete evidence that Madeleine was dead. He did not say "we think." He did not say "it is likely." He said he knew, but he would not tell them what the evidence was. To the parents, this was a fresh kind of agony. To be told their daughter was murdered, but denied the proof was agonizing. Wolters argued that revealing the evidence would jeopardize the investigation. He needed Bruckner to slip up. He needed an accomplice to talk. If he played his hand too early, the chance for a conviction would vanish. The world waited for the arrest. It seemed inevitable. Police raided an allotment in Hanover where Bruckner had once lived. They used excavators to dig up the foundations of a garden shed. They searched a hidden cellar. They searched a well in Portugal. They found a USB stick with disturbing illegal content, but they did not find Madeleine. The concrete evidence turned out to be a legal trap. It was likely a confession, perhaps the one made in the bar, or another made on a chat room, or perhaps photos found on his devices. But in a court of law, without a body, without DNA linking him to Madeleine, a confession could be retracted. It could be dismissed as drunken boasting. Bruckner was already in prison. He was serving a 7-year sentence for the assault of an elderly American woman in Praia da Luz in 2005, a crime that had gone unsolved for years until his DNA was matched. This gave the prosecutors time, but the clock was ticking. The German legal system is complex. In 2024, Bruckner faced trial for other serious offenses committed in Portugal. The strategy was to lock him away for decades, ensuring he would never be free to harm again, even if the McCann murder charge could not stick. But the case began to crumble. Witnesses were unreliable. The evidence for the other crimes was old and circumstantial. In October 2024, the court acquitted him of the other charges. The acquittal was a disaster. It meant that once his current sentence for the assault expired in 2025, Christian Bruckner would be a free man. The concrete evidence regarding Madeleine had not resulted in a charge. The prosecutor admitted they did not have enough to take to court yet. They were 90% sure, but 90% is not enough to convict a man of murder. The specter of the prime suspect walking free, grinning at the cameras, became a very real possibility. The justice that had seemed so close in 2020 was slipping away like sand through fingers. May the 3rd, 2023, marked the 16th anniversary of the disappearance. In the village of Rothley, the crowd gathered at the War Memorial, as they did every year. But the crowd was smaller now. The media presence was minimal. The urgency had faded into a dull, chronic ache. Kate and Jerry McCann stood in the circle of candlelight. They were older now. The lines on their faces told the story of 16 years of waking up every morning to the same void. They held hands, their grip tight, a physical anchor in a world that had tried to tear them apart. Standing with them were the twins, Sean and Amelie. They were 18 years old. They were at an early developmental stage when the screaming started. Now they were adults, ready to go to university. They had grown up in the shadow of a sister they could barely remember, but whose absence defined their entire lives. Amelie took the microphone. It was the first time she had spoken publicly. Her voice was steady, but her words were heartbreaking. "It is nice that everyone is here," she said, looking at the faces of the villagers who had supported them. "But it is a sad occasion. A sad occasion." It was an understatement that carried the weight of a lifetime. The investigation had run its course. Operation Grange was winding down, its budget finally capped. The German investigation was stalled. The Portuguese case was closed. The theories had all been exhausted. The parents, the burglars, the traffickers, the drifter in the van, each one had been chased to the edge of the earth, and each one had dissolved into uncertainty. The truth of what happened in apartment 5A likely lies in the mind of a single man, sitting in a German prison cell, refusing to speak. Or perhaps it lies with a man who is already dead. Or perhaps, most terrifyingly, it lies with a stranger who has never been on any suspect list, someone who passed through the night and left no footprint. Kate McCann once wrote that the hardest thing was the not knowing. Death is final, grief has a process, but disappearance is a state of suspension. It is a sentence without an end date. As the candles burned down in Rothley, the darkness pressed in. But the McCanns did not leave. They stayed until the last flame flickered. They had made a promise to Madeleine. "We will never give up." They knew the chances of finding her alive were non-existent. They knew the chances of a legal conviction were slim. But the search was no longer just about justice. It was about truth. It was about bringing a child home, even if only to lay her to rest. The story of the shadows of Praia da Luz does not have an ending. It ends not with a gavel banging in a courtroom, but with a silence. It ends with an empty room, a window that was once open, and a family walking forward, carrying their sorrow like a stone that never gets lighter, only more familiar.